Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Charlene Ortiz, and today we are going to be covering the first chapter of research methods. Now, this lecture is going to talk about the very basic foundations of research. So, for example, we're going to talk about what's the scientific method? What does that involve, right? So, identifying a problem, identifying potential research venues, develop a research plan. So, today we're going to be covering the basic aspects of research. We may likely cover other aspects of, okay, so if we conduct a variable, what are we studying, right? So we're going to talk about the different types of variables. What are variables? Why are we interested in having these types of variables? What do we need in order to define a variable? So these are some of the topics that you may be exposed to today. These topics are generally pretty broad, so it can help anyone in the social sciences field. So not only psychology, but social work, sociology, and things of that nature. And if there are no questions, let's get started. Okay, fantastic. So something about science is whenever people hear the term science, they think they know what they're talking about, right? But ultimately, science is just one way to know, right? So science is simply a way to acquire new knowledge, right? Some people may use experience as a new way to acquire knowledge. So for example, if you've never boxed before and you start boxing, you're going to learn how to box, right? So that's a method of acquiring knowledge. The science, on the other hand, the difference between, say, you learning from experience and you learning something through the scientific method, I should say, it's because with science, you use the scientific method, right? Within the scientific method, we're going to find out that is a systematic techniques have to be used in order to filter out, for example, things like bias, right? So imagine if you're only acquiring knowledge from experience, I should say, you're going to be a little biased, right? You're going to say, well, I'm probably the best boxer in this gym, right? Whereas in the scientific method, when we use that, we start getting rid or minimizing the risk of bias. So any questions about that so far? Something immensely important about the scientific method is that we use direct or indirect observation. We use direct or indirect observation in order to acquire knowledge. So what do I mean by that? If right now I asked you to measure me, right? So you can use my mass, my volume, my weight. You can use my height. You can use my temperature, right? So hopefully I don't have a fever or something crazy like that and I don't feel a little rody, right? So you have a direct observation to measure me, right? Now let me ask you another question. What's anger? What does anger look like? What color is it? What does it smell like, right? Hopefully it smells okay, right? So notice that we cannot directly observe certain variables that we're interested in. Some people, that's one of the main differences between the hard sciences, for example, physics, chemistry, because they have direct observation. Whereas us in the social sciences, we rely a lot on indirect observation, right? So you can't see anger, right? But you can see me grabbing my phone, my water bottle, and just tossing it against that wall as hard as I can. You can say, it's not the shark's anger. Well, that's one inference. But maybe I threw that because I saw a big old spider, right? So maybe I'm not angry at all. But part of the scientific method is defining variables so that we can accurately measure perhaps a variable that cannot be directly observed. Any questions about that? So something important about the scientific method is that one of the first things that we need to do is identify a problem. So the first step that we're going to engage in is identifying the problem. Now, generally with the scientific method, we want to identify the problem Usually, we can solve this problem through an observation, right? So I'll give you an example. Say you identify the problem that you're attending a class and all students keep failing, right? Everybody takes the class with Dr. So-and-so, they always fail. Maybe this problem can be resolved simply by conducting a systematic observation. What did we observe? Does the professor not show up? Does he not post the slides? Does he not have a YouTube channel, like and subscribe, right? So via observation, we could perhaps address this problem. There are multiple ways in which we could be able to identify a problem. First one would be determine an area of interest, right? Some of you may already know about a topic that you've seen that's a problem, right? Something that you have identified before that you're thinking, this is a big problem. Anybody has an idea like, wow, this is an issue. Whether it be in society or here, anybody has an idea of a problem they've seen? Anybody? Yes, ma'am.
School anxiety.
School anxiety. It's a big old one, especially because I worked in the counseling center. That has to happen a lot with people who already came in with a scholarship. There's a lot of high demand, high reward, right? You're gonna pay for everything, but you also have to do everything, right? So she identified that problem, whether it be by experience or by observing it in other people. Another way to identify a problem is by reviewing the literature. I'm going to zoom in on that a little bit more. This is too small. Let's do it. So when we identify a problem, when we identify the problem, we can also do it via literature review. And I know we all love that, right? To actually sit down and look what the literature says. We can also find out new areas of interest. So in these new areas of interest, we can say COVID. And that's a new area of interest. Another area of interest that I actually observed yesterday with my intro class is that if you think about it, about 90% of my students are straight from high school in that class. There's about 100 people something in that class. It's a lot of people. And if you think about it, they haven't seen other people for like a year. They haven't seen other students. But now they're in a big old classroom with 100 people. That could be an identified problem based on something that's brand new. We can also develop research hypotheses. In the research hypotheses, right, developing this hypotheses, we want to develop a testable claim, right, which would be this point right here. And what do I mean by a testable claim? So by developing a testable claim, a hypothesis is a prediction, right? That's what a hypothesis is. If A happens, B will follow, right? That's a prediction. Which in turn, interestingly, psychology is in the business of predicting behavior. Right? If I know what normal behavior looks like, and then all of a sudden, Peter over here says, I see demons in the wall, right? Which is really common when people have schizophrenia or psychotic breaks. It's always demons or angels, huh? Or somebody who died. That's generally like the three. I want something original one day. Maybe they'll say, I saw a pink elephant or something, but it's usually those. So if I know what normal behavior looks like, I can make a prediction of how this normal behavior would continue, unless there's an inserted variable. So for example, chemical imbalance, brain structure that was ruined in some way. And that's what a hypothesis is. We're trying to make a testable, predictable sentence. It has to be testable. If I can't test a hypothesis, it's no good. Right? So we want to make sure that that hypothesis is testable. Any questions about identifying a problem?
Good deal.
Now, the next step we're going to talk about is that we are going to develop a research plan. Why is that important? Why do I have to develop a research plan? When it comes to testable ideas, if we want to test something, we want to make sure that we have a plan established. Why is that? That is one of the big differences between guesswork and a scientific method. Because if I have a plan, first of all, my study will be more scientifically sound. And second of all, if I have a plan, what's your name, ma'am?
Sarah.
Sarah. So if I come up with a research study and I have a plan
And I go through A through B and I conduct my plan correctly.
Sarah should be able to grab my same study.
And be able to do it herself.
That's another reason why we develop a research plan. Because we should be
Able to replicate a study.
if she replicates my study and she follows it to the T, and she doesn't come up with similar or same results, there's a problem. Did I forge my results? Are my statistics faulty? Was not
The intention. Did she do something wrong? Right. So we need to find, usually it comes in the way of the original researcher, right?
Now, how exactly
We develop.
a research plan? One of the first things that we need to consider is that we need to identify those participants or subjects. On a funny note, a participant generally
We refer to humans as participants because they have willingly consented to be part
and participate. That's why they're called participants.
subjects. We usually refer to subjects as animals. Right? Animals are the ones that we usually refer to subjects because they inherently didn't provide consent. You just see a lab rat, so I'll do it, and sign it, right? Put his little handprint.
Yes, ma'am.
If you were to test plants for some reason with baby subjects,
I would call them subjects.
yeah, I figured that.
I would call them subjects because
they didn't provide
I guess that was just a question.
consent.
no, there's no stupid question.
This is what you're here for. You're here to learn.
And chances are, if you have the question, at least another person has that question. They just, I don't want to say that. Okay, so I don't want you to think that about yourself. Now, what's a population? So a population, let's see if I can get creative. Anybody in art here? Art thing? Okay,
Minority.
I'm awful. So,
And you're about to witness that.
so let's see if I can do it. Okay. So a population,
We are talking about, you want to identify.
that area. Try to find a really good blank space.
It didn't work.
Let's try it again. There we go. So a population could be, I don't know why it won't take. Let's try it again.
See that? It won't write for me. I'll use a traditional method. How about that? We're gonna go old school.
When we're thinking about a population, I want you to think about the greater sample. I want you to think about that greater group, right? So for example, what's your name again?
Kate.
Katie?
Yeah.
Kate.
Don't say Captain Bacon on the roster. Don't say Captain Bacon on the roster, but I'm Kate.
Which one do you prefer?
Kate.
Kate. So you shall be Kate.
I hereby knight you, Kate.
Right. So a population,
Right. She mentioned student anxiety.
so what's,
It's a good circle.
right, our people,
That's pretty good.
all right. So she mentioned,
Student anxiety.
what type of students? Are we thinking just UH students? Are we thinking about all the sister branches? So for example, the community
Community colleges that are so Calhoun.
Are we thinking about
A&M. Are we thinking about UAB? So a population could be the broad, greater group of things. So that's what a population is. Unless you have extraordinary financial means. So for example, the census would be a study with the population because they quite literally try to get a good scope of the entire US population. So let's say we're only interested in the population at this university, right? It will be impossible, if not unlikely, for us to talk to every single student in this on this campus about their school anxiety. So that's when we start looking at a sample. So this greater sense is considered the population, but the smaller portion will be considered a sample. I gotta pick that up though. Don't let me leave that marker here because they are in high demand. I want to do that. Now, when it comes to a sample is simply that subset of that greater group. Generally, this is more realistic. It's a better expectation, right? I'm not saying we probably wouldn't have the funding to talk to every single student on campus, but realistically speaking, you're probably only going to be able to talk to a specific percentage of the population here. Any questions about that? The next thing that I would like to talk about is the research design. Now, in the ways that we prepared that research design is likely, and it's largely dependent upon how you defined that variable initially. So let's talk about that for a second. Let's talk about why it's important for us to define a variable. A variable is any value or characteristic that can change, or as the term suggests, it can vary. Either from one person to the other, or from one characteristic to the next. So who can tell me about something that varies? Let's talk about emotions. Anybody can give me an idea. Yes, ma'am. Oh, I saw you.
Well, anxiety.
Anxiety. Okay, that could be a variable. What's anxiety to you? Nervousness. What's anxiety to you?
Anxious apprehension. Anxious, oh, not anxious. Nervous apprehension.
Nervous apprehension. Anybody else can tell me what anxiety is?
You're scared of the future.
Scared of the future. That's actually immensely close to like the textbook definition. But notice that in this small sample, we had 3 separate definitions of the same variable. How scientific is that? Not very sound, right? And I'm sure there's as many definitions of anxiety as there are psychology students and social work students and all that. That is why operational definitions are important. And what's an operational definition, right? An operational definition is that we're trying to disclose and find out how exactly what operations are we going to conduct to measure that variable. So the definition's in the term, right? Operational definition is which operations are we going to do to measure that variable. So for instance, let me give you an example.
And operational, let's stay with our flavor of anxiety. Say we define anxiety as
Fear of the future, which is it is the most basic or comprehensive definition.
general. Depression is fear of the past. Anxiety is fear of the future. Anxiety is, I'm going to mess up in this class. Dr. Shar is going to fail me. The assembly can't help me with my written assignments. That's anxiety.
Depression would be, I've never been good in any class. I always fail in math classes or research classes. I always wake up late. I can't study for this class. That's fear of the past. If you have both, well, this time you're not focusing in the future. So what can we do about it? If you're thinking about the future, you're thinking about the past, what you're gonna do in the future? Right?
That's neither here nor there. It's a little fun fact. So let's think about anxiety. We talked about fear of the future and want to operationally define this term. We will have to define what fear is.
Is fear crying? Is fear hiding, right? Is fear not showing up to class, right? So we will have to define that. And what is future? Is it tomorrow? Is it next week? Is it the entire semester? So for this scientific study, we're going to define anxiety as fear of the future,
As demonstrated by not showing up to class the fall semester of 2021.
I can measure that because I know we can literally count how many times you do and do not show up to class. And I have a time frame.
How am I going to measure it? As evidenced by the Beck Anxiety Inventory,
Which is a reliable,
assessment, very short, takes about 10 minutes. So notice that I operationally defined the term anxiety. I told you what it's going to look like. It looks like not showing up to class during the fall semester. And I told you how I'm going to measure it. I'm going to measure it based on Beck Anxiety Inventory. So it's not wishful thinking. It's like, I think,
Peter has more anxiety than Jessica. No, that's not what I said. Because we're using an assessment, an instrument that has been shown to be
reliable. So I described the operations that I will do this semester in order to measure that variable. So let's go back to the research design. Notice that how I come up with my study is going to highly depend on that operation. I already know that I will need access to
my students,
access to their
attendance records. I will need access to their responses
for the Beck Anxiety Inventory.
and that all those little bits of information,
I will make a list of that research design.
so that another researcher can replicate it, right? So if she were to do the same thing with similar students next fall semester, she should get the same levels of anxiety, or at least
Similar results of what I got. Because I literally explained the research design.
anxiety is defined as fear. Fear is defined as not showing up to class. And she will have this list that she can follow along with that research design.
That's what makes it scientific.
Right.
Let's think about COVID, right?
Research in science changes frequently, right? Because we adjust terms in order to be operationally defined, right? So sometimes when we initially define a term, for example, what's a mask? Right? Is it a cloth mask? Is it an N65? Right? Is it a mesh mask? Is it a Freddy Krueger mask, right? So when we change operational definitions, the results may be different. So they might have been consistent at some point, but then if there are, say, for example, other variables inserted, i.e. another variant, like the Delta variant, this will turn into a whole different study, which means the information we received from that initial study may or may not apply to this new study because literally the variable is different. We had that basic B COVID, and now we have like COVID on steroids, right? So makes sense. We keep it wholesome here. Keep it wholesome.
Any questions about
Research design. Generally, when we do a research design, it's measured numerically. All right. This is something immensely interesting that I would like to cover very briefly. I don't want to spend too much time on it.
But we already covered identifying this specific, if I can get the pen to work, am I right or am I right? How about that? Hey, look at that. Say hallelujah. So we have,
I can go back to it.
there we go. We already talked about identifying the behavior. So for example, we talked about
Because of experience, we saw that there's school anxiety. So we identified that behavior or events of interest. Now,
the next question we will need to ask ourselves is,
can this behavior be directly
or indirectly observed? And if you're in social sciences, as I mentioned earlier, generally our stuff is indirectly observed.
Because if I were to ask you, what color is school anxiety?
How much does it weigh? You think. Right? So we don't know how much it weighs. We don't know what it looks like.
So this will be considered indirectly.
So now we can move on to the yes. Can I measure school anxiety? Well, we operationally defined it, right? We said that it's going to look like fear of the future, and fear is going to be defined as how many absences we will have in the fall semester of 2021. So we know that we have school anxiety. We know that it is indirectly observed. We are going to measure it based on fear and anxiety as evidenced by the Beck anxiety inventory. So we define the operation in as we are going to gather attendance, we are going to gather anxiety results. So notice that that short example that you provided in class could theoretically, or hypothetically, I should say, be considered scientifically sound, right? Any questions about that? It's basically just I lied, or we did in class. Anyway, fantastic. What is to conduct that study? For all those little steps that I just mentioned about the research design, so we're talking about finding out a sample, right? So we would have to define this population, right? The campus population. Does it include online students? Does it include graduate students? Is it only psychology students, right? So I would have to define that population. Now let's define our sample. Is it only going to be psychology students? See, the microphones are being violent right now. So is it only going to be psychology students? Is it only going to be graduate students? Is it only going to be online students? The other question to ask is my little sample, right? Is my little sample of people that I gathered representative of the population that I have here, right? So in a very basic sense, notice that my sample, I illustrated students as whole triangles, but then we have all sorts of different flavors and sizes and everything. So this sample wouldn't be representative, which tells me that the sample may not, the results that we have here with school anxiety may not apply to the rest of the population because I didn't draw a somewhat representative sample. So when we, that's a little bit ahead of time, but when we start talking about representation, I should say, of samples, we'll talk about that a little bit later. We define our population, we define our method. Now we can actually roll up our sleeves and execute the research plan. One of the things that we need to consider when we are executing the research plan is not only do we need to worry about that definition of that variable, But something really interesting is that participation must be voluntary. What? It has to be voluntary. And why is that? Well, say, for example, if I were to conduct a study and I say, everybody that participates in the study is going to
Get an A in this class.
like, yes, sign me up, let's do it. The problem was that is a form, it's almost a form of coercion. The reward is too great, let's call it that. So was it really voluntary though? Think about a medication, right? I'm going to pay you $10,000 if you test this medication on you, or you're going to lose all your hair. Right? It's like, that's $10,000, that buys me a couple ways, let's do it, right? So is it really voluntary? Right? Sometimes it could be actually coerced, right? We have examples of that, unfortunately, in
Previous examples of prisoners of war, right? So we have
by force,
made people
participate in studies, for example, of starvation, right? How long does it take
you
you?
to die, right? Because you're not getting food.
So that's not voluntary now, is it? Because most people don't want to. So that's really important. It has to be voluntary, which is why we call people participants and animal subjects, because they really didn't volunteer. Generally, each institution will have an ethics committee. Generally, they will have an ethics committee, and I've been through that process. It's immensely tedious to get anything approved, but that's for a reason, because we've done so many horrible things in the past with participants that this is a necessary measure. It must be tedious in order for us to conduct studies. Unfortunately, because of things that have occurred in the past. Some of you might have heard of the Zimbardo experiments. Who can tell me about that? Anyway, volunteer, right? Yes,
That
ma'am.
was the prison experiment, wasn't it?
Yes. Yeah. So basically, very shortly summarized, students were given the opportunity to either be prison guards or inmates, and
The prison guard,
or correctional officer, which is the politically correct term, by the way. So now you learned that. They are police, they are law enforcement. So correctional officers, the students that were playing that role actually got a little too less, let's call them authoritarian. And they're actually engaged in abuse with the other students. Right? That was a professor, by the way. Had there been better ethical standards, that probably wouldn't have occurred. You also had the
Milgram experiments. Anybody know about that?
yes, ma'am.
They had a researcher bringing participants and they were shocking participants about
So what she meant, what's your name?
Carol.
I'm awful with names. So I used to be better with faces, but now I can only see half your face. So now I'm only half as good of being bad of not knowing faces. Look at that, statistics. Here we go. So what it was, we would have a confederate, which is what we call
The individual, someone who is in on it, on the experiments.
and
The idea was that we have another person in another room.
and every time they answered a question incorrectly,
And that person was a Confederate also.
the participant, i.e. any of you, would have to administer shock to the person who wasn't answering correctly. But unfortunately, the fake shock, because they were not actually shocking the person, that person was a Confederate, they were in on it. They would engage in that shock greater and greater and greater until the person stopped talking, right? To give the person the illusion that they had fainted or worse, right? The study is unethical because it caused psychological harm to the participant, thinking that they were actually harming someone physically and emotionally. And although we did learn a lot about behavior in that instance, that would be something that would probably not fly today unless we had a lot of ethical standards, a lot of ethical precautions. So that's why we have those ethical committees. Any questions about ethical standards? Basically, don't want to hurt anybody. Now, one of the last things that we're going to do
when it comes
to conducting a study is that we will analyze and evaluate the data. Because simply gathering the data like we did, we're gonna gather the attendance of these students with school anxiety, I should say.
gathering their back anxiety inventory scores is not enough. I actually have to
Analyze that data.
analysis is basically understanding the information so that we can come up with new information. And I was an intelligence analyst back in the day. So it's not me simply saying, hey, there's Selvin right here in this corner. Okay, well, that's great. What are we going to do about it? So that's what analysis is. You come up with new information based on the data that you already collected, right? What does this information tell me? So that's what you're going to do with the data that you collected during when you were conducting your research.
We're going to conduct an evaluation of that data. And what is data? What is data? It's generally information that has a numerical value.
It's in numerical units.
And generally, one of the first things we're going to assume
Is that there's no difference, right? That there is zero value in that assessment, right? What do I mean by that? We're going to assume if we grab this big old sample, right? When we grab our sample, we're going to assume that these people are average. They have their average anxiety, right? Because they're representative, right? For example, somebody here in this room right now may have a lot of anxiety. And then we have another person here that's super chill. We don't want those people necessarily. We want the person who is average, right? So there's no big, they're not super in the negative, they're not super in the positive. We want just someone in the middle. And why is that? Because we want the data to be as representative of the average Joe of our population as possible. And for those of you who have taken statistics and things of that nature, you know, that's an outlier, right? Something that's way off the charts and that can ruin our whole
data analysis. Something interesting about research is that whenever we summarize our data,
we need to make sure that it is concise. Anybody here with like an English minor or something like that? No, literature, okay. Generally, when we think about writing, we think we have to fluff things up and make it sound oh so great, like you're the next great American poet, or you want to be Shakespeare, or what's his name, Henry Lamar, or something like that. That's not who you want to be. Okay? You don't want to be that person. You want to be able to report results in a concise manner, because science is already difficult. Why make it more difficult, right? So you want to make sure that the average scientist or the average PhD could grab your research and be like, oh, I understand this. You don't want it to be so complicated that if we have Dr. Kate, all right, so if we have Dr. Kate, I'm like, here, Dr. Kate, here's my study, and it looks like, you know, antique
Egyptian hieroglyphs, then I did a good job at summarizing that
data. And I'm sure a lot of you have had professors that they will be talking about something, you're like, what language is this? Right. So how good is us providing that information to you? They have all the data, but how is that information being summarized to the consumer, right? Which is the point of this class, is for you to become a consumer.
The point of this class is towards the end of the semester, you should be able to grab a scientific article and be like, oh, I understand that. I can apply it later in my practice. That's the whole point of this class. How do we summarize that data? Sometimes we can show it graphically, right? So you start having your pie charts, things of that nature. But just like it, you're not the next Eminem or Kendrick Lamar, and you're not a lyricist, or you're not Shakespeare, you're not the next American poet. You also don't want to be the next great artist, right? You don't have to fluff him up and make it look 3D. And the point is to make it simple so that the average person can understand your graphs. By the same token, if you don't need that table,
If you don't need that graph,
don't include it.
You're wasting your time, you're wasting the other person's time. If you don't need it for the summary, I'm going to notice, it's like, why do we have this table? This is a waste of paper, right? And the average person who's familiar with research would say, this is just fluff. Generally, what we use in our field is the guidelines for the American Psychological Association. And boy, do they have guidelines, right? So we want to make sure that we use the American Psychological Association methods and that we can at least understand them. Some of us may say, well, you know, what's the point in that? Right? Why do I have to use APA's standards, right? The thing is that if we all write the same way, we should all grab, say, I can give you a sheet of like research about anxiety, and I can give him a sheet of research on depression, and I can give the next person a research on schizophrenia. And generally, all of you should be able, if all the papers use APA, you should be able to find, this is my intro, this is my method, this is my conclusion, right? So it should be easy enough that the next person and the next person and the next person is able to grab a research and be able to at least find out where things are. So that's and also it minimizes the chances of plagiarism, right? If you have to write a certain way, we can tell, did you write this? Or did the actual scholar write this? And you're like, by delete, me, I wrote that, right? That's another reason why we follow those guidelines. So they're not particularly useless. I know it feels that way, but there's actually a good purpose for it. Any questions on that? Okay. How's the anxiety right now? How a lot of you, how are we feeling? A little better? Ah, look at that. Good. Now, a method of communication, right? When we're trying to communicate our results. We have many ways to do that. It could be an oral communication, which is what you will be doing for this course. You will be reporting your results in an oral fashion. We can also use written forms of communication or a poster. Generally, a poster is a big old summary, I should say, about all of your research method, right? What did you do? So your introduction, previous literature. It's a summary in just one visual theme to show you everything I found out about the research previously and what we found out in my research, right? I would think a lot of you have either seen or heard about poster presentations, and that's generally when we acquire new knowledge, right? Now, interestingly, the point of communicating your results, although other than you're gonna feel so proud of yourself, because you look at me, Mom, I have a whole poster, right? Other than you feeling proud of your job, which I encourage you to do, because quite frankly, you're gonna be the person that's going to be interested the most, right? Other than feeling proud, the real reason we communicate our results is that allows peers and subordinates or people above you to review your work. And if you remember earlier what I said, we have to be able to review your work, because if I'm not able to review your work, how do I know you didn't make it up? Right? How do I know you're not selling me some snake oil? Right? So I'll give you a good example. Sometimes you'll see a product online. It's like, if you wear this hat, your depression is going to go down. I mean, you're going to be the happiest person on the planet, right? And they'll tell you, we have clinical studies to show that. Okay, when you look into their results, when they communicate their results, you see that these people only felt better as the average person would feel better without treatment, without wearing that hat. So notice that the person only felt better because that's how they would naturally feel after a certain amount of time. So that hat, that your product, even though there was a study about it, did the hat actually work to reducing your depression?
That's why we have to communicate results.
Because it gives other people the opportunity, i.e. the FDA,
Other agencies, people like you and me, the average consumer. Right? So that's one of the reasons.
we like to gather that data.
And I think
That would be the end of our lecture. Any
questions, comments, concerns? Yes, ma'am.
So depression is fear of the past and anxiety is fear of the future. What's fear of the present? If anxiety is fear of the future and depression is fear of the past, what is fear of the present?
That's a good question.
Why would you be afraid of the present if you can't control it? Like I can't quite literally say, I'm gonna shut this book.
You can be afraid of like what's going on at the present. Like, would it be panic? Because like if you're having a panic attack,
Right, a panic attack is still fear of the future.
If you're having a panic attack right now,
Means that it was an expectation of the future. So we will have to identify that trigger.
so the answer is you can't really be fearing the present.
sorry,
So the answer is you can't really fear the present.
I wouldn't think so unless
There's
there's
some sort of like schizophrenia going on, like your present is quite literally, I'm seeing jumping demons in the classroom,
like life and in color right now.
in technicolor.
That may be lost in some of you,
Live in technicolor.
unless you're a certain age.
Like she but interesting. Thank you.
All right, any more questions? Anybody going once, going twice? All right, well, thank you guys very much for your attention.
And we shall be moving on to lab. What? Thank you guys for your attention.